Air combat has changed dramatically over the decades, but what seems to be in store for the next generation of air combat may be one of the biggest changes yet. This video will explain what the so-called 6th generation fighters and next generation air combat aim to bring to the table. How will that differ from today's air combat? Why is plane versus plane meaningless in air combat, and why an Air Force versus Air Force is what this video will focus on. Ultimately, what will it take to achieve air superiority come year 2040? Next generation air combat is still a decade or more away, but next generation wallet tech is here. Exter, our sponsor, sent us their Parliament wallet. Look at how slim this thing is. I always have a bunch of cards with me, and in my old wallet it was a hassle getting to all of them. Exter wallet can hold up to 12 cards. My most used cards go in this special holder here. One click and they pop out. Love that. I love the fun leather too. I barely use cash, so this thing is just for me. Parliament wallet comes in 6 different colors and can block RFID signals, so you don't have to worry about wireless theft. But this Finder card is my favorite. I paired it up to my phone and now I can track my wallet. Can't tell you how many times I left it in my car by accident. It's also great if it gets stolen. Anyway, Exter is having a Valentine's sale right now, giving you 30% off. The wallet makes a great gift. But if you click below in the video description, use my link and my unique code BINKOV, you will get up to 40% off. So check it out. Though dogfights were still common in World War II, most air kills were actually done with the victim not getting any warning. Both German and US ace pilots independently realized that ambush tactics, surprise and speed advantage were giving better results than focusing on dogfights. Basically, dogfights fell out of fashion even by World War II. By Vietnam, they became even rarer. And 25 years later, in the Gulf War, dogfights became almost extinct. Gun usage was reserved for special cases. BVR missiles were used in over 50% of all kills in the 1990s. First serious air-to-air missile usage came in the 1960s. Even during the Vietnam War, changes were visible. And the Gulf War brought huge changes in the way air combat was done. 25 years after the Gulf War was 2016. That's already almost a decade in the past. Basically, technology used to wage air combat has changed tremendously in those 35 years. It's literally a change like going from guns only to mostly missiles, only in a direction that's looking to be completely reliant on missiles. And not just that, but as the distance of engagements grew over the decades, it's inevitable that even the current air combat would be done at huge distances, likely over 20 kilometers even between stealthy fighters, or sometimes even over 100 kilometers against other fighter jets. And that's just today's air combat involving 4th and 5th generation jets. It's no wonder that over 30 years, the main US missile AMRAAM increased its reach from 50 or so kilometers to over 150 kilometers, give or take depending on target type, situation and so on. Large surface-to-air missiles kill at even greater ranges, often while still traveling over Mach 5. The ability to quickly point the nose of your fighter jet has become largely irrelevant. Indeed, other design requirements often overshadow such maneuverability. What is still important and will become even more important in next-generation air combat is the ability to change location quickly, to rise from 30,000 feet to 50,000 feet in minutes, to move 20 miles to the side in just minutes. Of course, fighter jets with low radar cross-section have more or less become the norm in production, but non-stealthy planes are still being produced, and non-stealthy jets still make up the majority of Air Force fleets around the world. Even in 2040, by which point there may be over 100 6th-gen fighters in both US and Chinese hands, a substantial number of non-stealthy jets will still be in service, even bigger than suggested when other non-US or Chinese parties are included, Taiwan, Japan and so on. It's gonna take more time for them to fully convert to newer planes. Why is all that important? Because air combat is done versus any part of the enemy system. Even if your enemy is a tanker plane or lesser generation fighter plane and you are in a 6th generation plane, that's still next generation air combat, as you will engage the enemy more efficiently than if you were using a less advanced plane. A 6th generation jet with ultra-low radar cross-section, excess range and long-reach missiles will be in a better position to sneak up on many different types of enemy aircraft. There's been talk of possible stealthy tanker planes for the US Air Force, but that's all very questionable by the 2040 period. Today, the air forces that are rich enough to operate 5th gen fighters use them as force multipliers and as silver bullets. Ideally, you want your forward planes like strike planes to be stealthy. They will perform better, but if you can render the SAMs ineffective by jamming or suppression, or if your weapons provide enough range that you don't need to go very close to threat areas, then maybe those strike planes can be F-15s rather than F-35s, for example. But inserting just a few stealthy planes helps a lot. It can tip the scale further in air combat. It can mean you strike the enemy first, or surprise him with a flanking maneuver, especially if you have an asset like F-22 which can go supersonic without use of afterburners. Suddenly the enemy may be caught off guard and your kill and loss ratio may be very favorable. Special mission planes such as AWACS and ELINT planes, and even jammers, were quite crucial in 4th generation combat. They would check for signals emissions and track enemy contacts over broad areas. Radio signal jamming, also meaning radar signal jamming, was and is hugely important, but it often requires specialized platforms. Or it did, until 5th generation equipment. Those started to come with radars which could switch roles and become jammers. Much weaker jammers, as the electricity surplus often wasn't there and thus the design wasn't there, but still. Those jammers can't really blind the modern AWACS, but they can mess with tiny radars inside missiles, so they can be very helpful for self-protection. 6th generation platforms will basically enjoy the sensors previous gen has, but only much improved and expanded upon. Today's most modern planes like the F-35 have sensors which basically rival sensors on ELINT planes of previous generations. Even the radar itself in F-35 and other potent fighters is good enough to see quite far away, probably hundreds of kilometers against fighter-sized targets, and process and track 100 targets at once. The plane can then share said info with other planes in the strike package. So somewhat similar to what an AWACS could offer, but there are key issues there. AWACS use radars working in different wavelengths, better against stealthy aircraft. They have more power available, and they can keep track of a 360 view all around. The F-35 can't do that, but 6th gen fighters will likely have more radar arrays covering more frequencies and more directions. Basically 5th and 6th gen planes became so multi-role that they also incorporate a lot of support platforms capabilities into a single fighter jet. But there are still limits to what the 5th generation can do. Its power generation capability is such that multiple large radar arrays can't be used. Those arrays also can't be used as long-range jammers. The planes themselves are not significantly larger than previous gen planes, and the engines, while often being able to supercruise, still don't offer significant fuel savings. The 6th generation will take all those concepts we mentioned a step further. Suddenly, some designs may be so large that they can hold even air-to-air missiles that are of far greater reach than the AMRAAM. Chinese PL-17 is one such example. It's essentially a shrunken S-400 missile in concept, only launched from a high-flying plane. It can be deadly even against fighter-type targets. It's rumored the US Air Force is developing its own long-range missile, in addition to AMRAAM's successor. Such larger 6th gen planes will provide long-range shots from behind, while smaller 6th gen planes may take point, mixed with 5th gen fighters. When we look at the Chinese next gen prototype, large cheek arrays are apparent. While not a novel concept, those radars are likely going to be much more potent than cheek arrays proposed for the F-22 back in the day, or the cheek arrays on the Russian Su-57. With multiple large arrays channeling similar power, switching between jamming and sensing, next-gen planes will approach the capabilities of AWACS, ELINT and jammer planes even more. Furthermore, a large part of AWACS' role may be taken over by specialized satellite constellations. Moving ground targets are already being tracked by radar satellites. And stealth development is not yet done. Next-gen planes are expected to lower the radar return several times over. That's possible not only by using novel materials, but also by changing design priorities. While current-gen planes like F-22 and J-20 still bet on maneuverability to some degree, next-gen planes are expected to more or less end said practice. It may lead to very boring lookalike designs, with everyone using flying wing triangle platforms. But such designs, using as few different surfaces as possible, may allow for even smaller radar returns. Sure, maneuverability would be sacrificed, but that may be worth the effort. Another important component of future generation air combat will be potent power plants. Some 5th-gen planes can supercruise, sure, but their engines are optimized mostly for that, which leads to large fuel consumption and fairly short range. Next-gen tech for engines is variable cycle engines, where at subsonic speeds the engine works as a fuel-saving turbofan, and at supersonic speeds it is a supercruising turbojet. The concept itself is not new, but it took decades for the technology to mature. Tactically, large planes with such engines will be able to expand the aerial battlefront by quite a bit. While an F-22 might have been expected to pull a few hundred kilometers off a flanking maneuver, the next generation of planes might be able to do 1,000 kilometers, enabled by the combination of lower fuel consumption and more fuel per unit of weight carried. Those speeds of around Mach 2 should still remain the sweet spot. 6th-gen fighters are unlikely to be designed for greater speeds, as Mach 3 won't make planes more effective, yet it would make them more costly. But the next generation of air combat is adding one more crucial element: attritionable wingman aircraft without crews. While each may still cost a few tens of millions of dollars, it won't be a huge deal if some are regularly lost in missions, as there might be like 1,000 or 2,000 in the US Air Force's inventory. Those are actual figures that have been thrown around by the Air Force's brass. Today's drones aren't really used for high-intensity combat. They are piloted remotely for a portion of their flight time. This new generation of drones is expected to have enough autonomy, enough advanced AI decision-making, that they can be commanded only occasionally, instead of having to be periodically piloted. Due to various data link technology limitations which we won't go into, today's thinking is that the best platform to direct those unmanned planes is a manned plane that is close by, as in close enough to regularly come under threat in air combat. So basically, manned fighter jets will help control and direct those unmanned wingmen. Now, even previous generation planes could be retrofitted to do that, sure. According to the US Air Force, F-22s were tested and worked fine with the sole pilot directing 5 drones. Air Force Secretary Kendall said they initially explored 3 to 5 drones per commanding fighter aircraft, but lately they have been looking into even more drones per manned fighter. Best results are likely going to be achieved when data links are custom designed and baked into the airframe of the plane, instead of being an addition or a repurposed data link. Additionally, having a separate drone operator as part of the 6th-gen fighter crew might be beneficial. That's not to say that all 6th-gen planes will have 2-man crews, but it's looking plausible at least some will, starting with the prototype China showed a month ago. That being said, 6th-gen planes are simply not gonna be that plentiful, so most of unmanned wingman control may still be done by previous generations. The US Air Force is already planning to do that with F-35s. Now, the US Air Force has done perhaps the most work on such wingman drones. They play-tested and simulated various concepts, and their conclusion is, for the near future, stealthy and expensive drones do not make sense. Apparently, a cheaper force of non-stealthy drones wins in most simulated scenarios. The US Air Force plans several different generations of drone wingman. First one, called CCA Increment 1, has fairly rudimentary stealth, and is also curiously subsonic. That one is to come online in the coming years, with 100 active service drones to fly by 2029. Two separate Increment 1 designs are to cost between a fourth and a third of F-35's flyaway cost, so roughly $25 to $30 million. The Air Force said Increment 2 would follow soon, and recently it was disclosed that even that won't be some exotic or very stealthy plane. Air Force Secretary Kendall said that another 20 to 30% higher price tag on top of Increment 1 would be acceptable. The key with those CCA aircraft is to have enough of them, not just tactically, but to be able to produce enough of them on a fairly short notice. In war economy terms, we might talk about months to a year. That may be the reason for the whole no stealth approach, but that is just a guess. Future drone increments may also be supersonic, since large 6th Gen fighters might remove the need for dedicated jammer and AWACS support. It might enable the whole formation to fly faster. So the air combat of the next generation may change that image of a complex strike package with various types of planes, and fewer special mission and support planes might be needed. There might be an even bigger focus on stealth and sensors, and there will be a large network of semi-disposable drones put out forward. Some jammers, some sensor drones, some missile carriers. If there is contact with the enemy, those drones will be the first to die, instead of expensive manned aircraft. In a way, that strike mission might be doable using just some 6th Gen planes as sensor and jammer enablers, missile arsenal planes, and silver bullet pursuit planes, while a greater number of stealthy 5th Gen planes would fill in the gaps, and the drones would still be doing the really dangerous part of the mission, serving as a tripwire network. In a way, 6th generation air combat is not gonna be mostly about 6th generation fighter jets. It's also gonna be about integrating unmanned wingmen into the fight. Who does that best and who has most of those, that may bring victory. Today's missiles are already far too reliable and far too agile for planes to evade them using close maneuvering. Tomorrow's missiles are gonna be even deadlier. Stealth helps, of course, and in some instances, there may be fights where missile launches will be done not at 100 or 300 kilometers away, but at 10 to 30 kilometers away, as two 6th Gen planes will simply not see each other until fairly close. A missile won't lock onto a very stealthy target from a long range, either due to thermal signature or due to the fact that millimeter wave radars inside missiles don't feature long ranges. Such seekers are becoming more widespread, precisely because it's hard to optimize stealth planes to counter those very short frequencies. But a dozen kilometers is still far too big of a distance for classic maneuverability to be important. What's gonna change are sensors, not just in the overall network, but on the fighter jets and drones themselves, as those satellite sensing networks might not work all the time. With so many more wingmen present, providing more sensors, and with fighter jets seeing in more directions, not just in the forward quadrant, the sensor network is gonna get more distributed and more robust, not overly reliant on a few high-value AWACS class planes. Proliferation of integrated thermal sensors on most planes and advanced geolocating electronic emission sensors will add to that. The image of the overall aerial battlefield will be bigger and more complete, against anything that's not a very low radar return 6th generation plane. It may become questionable if even F-35 or J-20 type planes, which are optimized to be stealthy mostly from their forward sector, will be able to regularly survive in such environments. That may be a problem if you lose your 5th Gen drone commander plane nodes just because your enemy has 6th Gen drone commander nodes which are more stealthy. Air combat of 2040 between two peer opponents may be quite boring for outside observers. It may involve everyone seeing almost everything, much like it has happened on the ground in Ukraine, where sensors are so ubiquitous that large and quick offensives achieving surprise became all but impossible. So far, it's looking plausible that ultra-low radar return planes may put a dent to that picture, with at least those planes being able to stay hidden longer. But remember, such 6th gen planes are gonna make up just several percent of overall force in the air for a few decades to come, possibly just a couple of percent when unmanned drones are included in the tallies. Before the review of the US NGAD next-gen effort, the US Air Force itself projected each fighter jet would cost $300 million, and that the total produced over time would be some 200 airframes. Now that may change, but it's still not likely we will see 500 plus planes by 2040. 6th gen planes will remain force multipliers, more numerous than AWACS to be sure, and much more multi-role, but still sparse. It's the drones that will do most of the fighting, and with little reliance on stealth and with focus on low cost, those will mostly do missile exchanges from afar, the last nail in the coffin of dogfights. More so than in other wars, next-gen air warfare may turn into a game of who can achieve higher production of aircraft and drones and missiles in particular, and who can sustain said production. Unless the technology gap between belligerents is huge, said production difference will be the one to decide the outcome of the war. Stuff like experience, morale, or pilot prowess may be secondary. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.